All right, so we just finished the recipient sites on this gentleman. This is a gentleman that was kind enough to allow us to do a video close-up. He's about 3 years out from a transplant, and this is his second session with us. And so these are all transplanted hairs in the front. These are his native hairs back here. There are some points of education I want to bring up. The first is why we don't shave a scalp. Some doctors, and I heard a lecture from a physician who said, we shave the scalp because it's so much easier on the placers, and that actually is true. It's much easier for me as a surgeon to shave the whole scalp, and it's much easier for my placers who place the grafts to have the entire area shaved. But in my opinion, there's several problems with that. Number one is when I wet the hair, I'm looking at how the hair affects the visual density. So in other words, if I have this whole area shaved and I can't tell how much denser pattern I have to put on one area versus the other, besides it being an incredible inconvenience for the patient in the post-operative setting to have all his hair cut off, I think that's a problem. And the other thing I'm looking at is the angles. And so the angles are changing here. They go a little bit farther in, and the reason why they do that is because we did the first session and I converged the pattern going in, which I'll explain in a moment, and then going out here, the angles change. And the angle changing is very hard to visualize if you shave down the scalp. You can't see, not only can you not see the visual density, you can't see the direction, the angles, and everything. And so I use that as my reference points as I design this scalp. So what is a convergence pattern? I just want to briefly touch upon this. What it is that the angles you can see go toward the center and midline. Now, why is that important? The visual density in the central forelock and the anterior hairline is probably the most important, or not probably, is definitely the most important area to make someone look visually denser. So if you think about our scalp, it's rounded like this, okay? So because it's rounded, grafts that are placed here tend to want to fall open, want to fall away from the zone of maximal importance. And what's very interesting, since I teach a course in St. Louis, the biggest mistake I've seen my students make is when they're making sites, because the scalp is not flat, they start to make sites that look like this, okay? The exact opposite of convergence pattern. There's a splaying that is very, very bad for a few reasons. One, it's uncombable. Two, is the exact opposite, as I alluded to, of the convergence pattern, meaning all the density is moved away from the center. So you actually look balder in that pattern. And I see that right-hand surgeons and left-hand surgeons have very different patterns. In other words, as my hand tries to go over here and make recipient sites, my angles look all over the place. And this is a very, very big mess. So what is my pattern? Besides the convergence, what you're seeing is as we go over to the side, it starts to slowly turn outwards. Now it's hard to see because it's hard to focus on all the details, but this starts to turn outwards for the temporal hair going across there. Over here, what's interesting when I was designing this is not only are the hairs first angled this way, then slowly coming out, but as we go back here, his angles actually turn in a little bit like this. And so how would I know that? Because again, I have his hairs not shaved. So anyone that tells you, hey, you know what, I think shaving the hair is great. Of course, there's many ways to do a procedure, and I'm not trying to tell them they're wrong, but I want to have you really understand why, for me, besides it being a real inconvenience for you to have a shaved scalp, which we don't do, why it's so important from a design perspective and why it's worth the quote-unquote inconvenience for both my staff and for me to design this. So hopefully this recipient site design makes some sense, and we'll talk about it further in other videos.